I told him. He stared at me for a full 30 seconds. Finally, he turned to his laptop, typed in some information and read. Well, here's a posting everyone would want. Tuscia University in Italy, but that opening doesn't start for 6 months, he said, and continued to scroll through. There is one that is open and looking for someone as soon as possible, but I'm not sure, he said as he continued reading. Where is it? I asked. It's through the University of Indonesia, but the assignment is pretty rural. There is a small village near Bima and… I interrupted him. I'll take it, I exclaimed. He abruptly looked up and studied me. Here, I'll send you a link. You really need to read through this. From what I understand, the people in Bima are wonderful, but it's quite a primitive environment. I know we've had people come home early from there. How soon would the program start? I asked. Like I said, he told me as he reread the information. They want someone as soon as possible. The link I sent you has all the details. Do you have a current passport? He asked. I remembered my high school church trip to Guadalajara. Yes, I assured him. Later, in my office, I read through the link Tim had sent me. This would be perfect, far away from Jasmine and the mess of my marriage. I then unfolded the small note page that Paul had given me with the lawyer he recommended. It read, John Scalia 618-937. I called and reached his law office. I explained what I wanted and made an appointment to meet with John the following day. His assistant in the meantime emailed me a list of information I was to bring, including any proof of infidelity. Thanks to Paul, I certainly had that. That night at home was difficult. I didn't want all the drama of a confrontation about her infidelity. I was sad that the marriage was ending and felt like a failure because of the pending divorce. But, try as I might, I could not imagine any scenario where we could stay married. Around the apartment, I stayed quiet and withdrawn. When Jasmine would ask what was wrong, I told her I was overburdened at work. In fact, I told her, I may need to go down to the farm later this week. This was my normal in-town week, but I thought it would save me the discomfort of pretending all was well with the marriage. I also watched Jasmine as I told her about my out-of-town schedule. I saw her glance away as if she were calculating a clandestine plan. I also saw a small smile cross her face ever so briefly in the midst of her concentration. I had a pretty good guess what she was thinking. The next day I met with my divorce lawyer, John Scalia. John was pleasant but businesslike. He was darkly complected with what looked like a permanent 5 o'clock shadow, heavy eyebrows, and piercing serious eyes. Owen, he began, why don't you give me a brief rundown of your relationship and your reasons to seek divorce? I went through it. The flirting at Papaya, the found cigar butt, and finally the electronic surveillance conducted by Paul Gamble. As I relayed to my attorney the fissures of my marriage, he studied me and nodded, as if he'd heard this story many times before. And I'm sure he had. Do you have the evidence? He asked, and I handed him the file. He silently reviewed the pictures, no expression on his face. I explained that my investigator, Paul Gamble, had others and video. I know Gamble, he said, not looking up from the sexually explicit photos. We then went over our few financial assets. We had a checking account with about $400 in it. The savings account had about $3,500 in it. I had my old Honda Civic, and she had her car that was probably worth more than the Civic. Furniture, clothing, and anything else was minimal. I provided him with a copy of our will and our life insurance policy. John studied all the documents for several minutes and then looked directly at me. So here's how this will work. He began. You transfer one half of the bank accounts into a new account in your name only. Remove only things from the apartment that are yours alone. I would advise against taking any furniture. Today is, and he glanced at a wall calendar, Tuesday the 19th. When would you like her served? He asked. He had to explain to me how all that worked. He told me he would file a petition with the court, and since in this state adultery is grounds for divorce, he would include evidence of the adultery. Paul's photos. I thought about it. Why not tomorrow? I'll be gone, ostensibly to the farm tomorrow morning. Actually, I'd be much further away. I would avoid any confrontation. I had decided I wanted to avoid seeing her again if at all possible. I told Scalia this, wrote him a check, shook his hand and left. Things were in motion. With nervous anxiety, I drove to campus to meet with my supervisor, Tim Kerwin, to file the papers for my overseas assignment in Indonesia. I had already emailed Tim the application and what seemed like reams of filled-out forms for the assignment. When I met him at his office, he had a huge notebook for me about my assignment. And then we went over the details. First the flight to Los Angeles, and then on to Jakarta. From there, a small commuter flight to the city of Bima. It would be ground transportation from there. Within the binder were my contacts, details about my living situation, and 1,000 other things. My exciting new life change was just beginning. It almost made me forget about my failed marriage. Almost. And through it all, for the first time since this all began, I began to be optimistic. This was going to be an adventure, and I was looking forward to it. I have made your vaccination appointments for tomorrow, Tim told me. Vaccinations? I questioned. Owen, of course. He told me. You are going into an area susceptible to tropical diseases. You need to be vaccinated. Your appointment is at 10 a.m. tomorrow at the campus clinic. Okay, I thought. I'll need to switch a few things around. Suddenly, a lot of things were in motion. I had to think this through. I had one more night in the apartment with Jasmine. I didn't want a confrontation. I just wanted to leave and have my lawyer take care of the divorce and be done with her. My plan was to leave in the morning early, as I would normally do when I went to the farm to do the research. I would then go to the university clinic and get my vaccinations. I knew Jasmine would be in classes until noon. After the vaccinations, I would swing back by the apartment and gather the rest of my belongings, and then head to Benton. My flight to Indonesia left on Saturday morning. I would have a family member drive me to the airport on Friday. I would stay at a local airport motel, and then Saturday morning I would start a brand new chapter in my life. I was nervous, excited, and sad, all rolled into this one odd emotion. At the clinics, I received several different shots and 4 different plastic bottles of pills. They also gave me a stack of pamphlets about potential tropical diseases and general information about healthcare. After that, I headed to the apartment one last time. I parked on the street. I wanted to avoid seeing Claude, and certainly I didn't want to see Jasmine. Yes, I know it was kind of a coward's way out, but I didn't care. My feelings for her had changed. I wanted to put this life failure behind me. I was eager to begin the next chapter of my life. This last one hadn't ended well. As I was leaving, my phone buzzed. I looked at the screen. Jasmine. I ignored it. I hustled down the alley and went up the stairs to the apartment. I had already packed my overnight suitcase as if I was going to the farm for work. I grabbed a large canvas duffel and packed the rest of my clothes. My phone buzzed again, and I got several text message alerts. I checked my phone. They were all from Jasmine. I wondered what that was all about, and then suddenly it hit me. She had been served. I had forgotten to ask Scalia to wait an extra day. With all I'd had to do in the past 24 hours, I had forgotten this detail. I needed to get out of here fast. I quickly finished loading the duffel, double-checked that I had my passport, and left. I just needed to get to my car unnoticed, and then I was gone. I peered out into the alley, and with great relief, I saw it was empty. Duffel over my shoulder, I moved quickly away from the apartment. About halfway down, I saw a large familiar silhouette block the far end of the alley. It was Claude Francis. My heart rate accelerated as I moved toward my exit onto the sidewalk. I had no issue with Claude. I just wanted out. I saw him, arms crossed, leaning against the brick of the building, a small, mean smile on his face. I was just going to try to ignore him and be on my way. Going somewhere, Owen? He asked with a false friendly tone, emphasizing my name. Just heading out, I said non-committally as I moved to get past him. Not so fast, he said, and moved directly in my path. I just heard from my sister, your wife. She's pretty upset. She said you're not answering your phone. He added. Look, Claude, I said as I tried unsuccessfully to get past him. This is between me and Jasmine. It's not your business. And with that, he straight-arm shoved me, knocking me back down the alley. I dropped the duffel. I already told you, he began. What happens to my sister is my business. Now you're going to wait while I call Jasmine, and then the 3 of us are going to figure this all out? He told me. I knew I needed to get out of there, quickly. I knew what a temper Jasmine had, and I wanted to avoid that entire confrontation. As Claude reached for his phone, I grabbed my duffel and quickly tried to slide by him. As I bumped him, he dropped his phone, and you could hear the screen crack as it landed. You scum sucker. He was more than angry now, and he shoved me this time, knocking me down. You broke my phone, he yelled. Once again, I got up, grabbed my bag, and moved to get by him. Claude, I'm leaving and you can't stop me. I told him, hoping what I said was true. This time it wasn't a shove, it was a fisted punch. He knocked me down and I saw stars. You've got to understand, I had never been in a fight in my entire life. I had no training in self-defense whatsoever. I didn't know what to do. A strange feeling came over me. I had no idea how I was going to get out of my predicament, and I was afraid of what Claude could do to me physically. I just knew that somehow I had to get out of that alley and away from Claude Francis. I thought maybe I could appeal to him man to man. Claude, I began. Jasmine was cheating on me with a guy named Jerome. I pleaded. Screw you, he said, and then slapped me across the face, hard, and it stung. "Do not talk about my sister like that," he bellowed at me. I knew I had to get out of that alley. Quickly I got up, faked to the right, and tried to run by him on the left. The duffel was forgotten. It was a matter of survival now. Just as I felt I was nearly by him, his meaty hand grabbed me and I stumbled. At that point, the true beating began. He was all over me, his punches like hammer blows. The side of my face, my kidneys, my head, any place I couldn't cover up. I contracted into a fetal position and absorbed the punishment. Some small survival mechanism kicked in and started calling for help. Fortunately, we were only a few feet from the mouth of the alley. Eventually, two guys passing by on the sidewalk started yelling at Claude to stop his beating on me. Through the ringing in my ears, I slightly perceived them saying something about the police. Claude stopped, kicking me one last time for good measure, and then he left. I remained frozen, afraid to uncoil from my protective position. One of the guys who had stopped bent down to me. "Hey buddy," he said. "You need help? Come on, get up, that man is gone." Slowly and cautiously I painfully stood. Through my bruised and bloody face, I thanked the two guys. They looked like students. I bent to grab my duffel and yelped in pain. "Buddy, let me get your bag," the other guy said. "Where do you want it?" he asked. I nodded toward my Civic, parked out on the street. As I slowly limped to my car with the two good Samaritans, I checked and made sure I had my phone, my wallet, my car keys, and my passport. I unlocked the door and he threw the duffel in the back. "Thank you." I was able to get out as I painfully climbed into the driver's seat. Shakily, I started the car, half expecting someone to come charging out of Papaya to try to stop me. Even after I had cleared city limits, I continued to check my rearview mirror. Every so often I'd catch a glimpse of my own face, bloody and bruised, reflected back at me. Finally, it must have been at least 50 miles out of town. I guess I realized I was safe. Suddenly, a different emotion flooded me. It was relief, coupled with sadness, anger, and shame. I began to shake. I had to pull off the highway. Shaking and sobbing, I sat in my used Civic, trying to calm down enough to be able to safely drive. Finally, thoughts swirling after the emotional last few days, I made myself a promise. I will never let someone beat me like that again. Somehow, someway, I was going to learn to defend myself. If I ever got in another confrontation like that, I may not win, but I surely was going to put up a fight. Something I knew I had not done when confronted by Claude. As I continued my journey away from my old life, I became angry. Angry at Jasmine for betraying our marriage. Angry at Claude for the physical bearing he gave me. And most of all, angry at myself for my cowardly reaction. That, I vowed, would never, ever happen again. A few days later, with my battered body ever so slightly beginning to heal, I was at the airport on the cusp of starting the next fresh chapter of my life. I saw an email from my attorney, John Scalia. "Your wife has been served and the petition for divorce with evidence of adultery has been filed with the court. So far, no contact from your wife or any retained legal counsel. Will report all interactions, Scalia." I felt relief to know that my lawyer was handling all interaction with Jasmine. I really and truly just did not want to ever see her again. Just then I heard the announcement that my flight to Los Angeles was boarding. Many hours later, the Los Angeles flight landed in Jakarta. The first thing that hit me was the humidity. It was like walking into a steam room at a health club, and then all the exotic smells. This was not like anything I had ever experienced, and I absorbed it. For so much of my life, I had been sheltered. Now, I was beginning to see how interesting the world can be. It was quite exciting, and for the first time in a long time, I was not thinking about Jasmine. Bima is on the island of Simbawa, and the airport is actually called Sultan Muhammad Salahuddin Airport. It was a bit confusing, but English was an acceptable language, and the people were quite friendly. Once I arrived, I referenced the accommodations in my notebook and arranged ground transportation to where I would be staying. The family I was assigned to live with were the Effendis. It was a husband and a wife, 2 young adult sons, and a younger daughter I guessed must have been about 10. They grew primarily coffee and cocoa. My room was separated from the rest of the house, kind of like a shed on small stilts. The kitchen and the bathroom were in the main house. Mrs. Effendi did the meal preparation. Things were primitive and efficient. I had 8 different farms I worked with, the furthest being around 60 kilometers away. There was a battered Toyota Kijang owned by the university that I had use of to travel to the different farms. I began to understand why my supervisor, Tim Kerwin, cautioned me about this assignment. There were long hours, primitive living conditions, and all the challenges of living in a tropical environment, including insects, snakes, and spiders. But I loved it. I developed a route, and all the people I worked with were so appreciative of my help, it more than made the work worth it. I was also learning some things too, and began writing articles based on my research. One night, after a long week, I was in my small room at the Affindis. All week I had worked on different farms analyzing soil, understanding fertilizer, growing trends, and crop rotation. I loved the work, but then I thought of my future. My hands were permanently stained with soil. My fingernails were constantly dirty, never completely clean. The grit of wind-blown dirt was always present in my scalp. Would this be my life? Hands soiled forever? This was something I pondered in that and other moments of solitude. One evening after I had returned to the Affindis in my living quarters, I saw the two Affindi brothers practicing some type of fighting, martial art. I watched them for quite some time. When they took a break, I asked them about the fighting. It is called Silat, EK, the older Affindi brother told me. We do not use weapons, just hands and feet, he told me. Then they explained that Silat is different from most other martial arts. There is nothing spiritual about this form of fighting, it is about violence. Silat uses strikes, pressure points, and grappling. It was developed for use in war, and it is all about conquering and disabling your opponent. Weapons can be involved, but as the Affindis had told me, they didn't train with weapons. I thought back to the vow I had made to myself after the humiliating confrontation with Claude Francis. Can you teach me? I asked. The older boy looked at his younger brother, Bakshi, and as if in unison, they both shook their heads negatively. Please, I begged them. I thought this was my opportunity to learn how to fight. Finally, they agreed, but they told me that I would likely get hurt during the training. They said that Silat was a violent form of fighting designed to incapacitate the opponent. They would try to take it easy, they said, but they wanted to warn me that it would likely be painful. I nodded with great enthusiasm. Yes, I told them, that was what I wanted. So, I began to train with them at least 3 days a week. I would spar with the Affindis and basically get beat up, but I was learning something that was completely new to me, and I was painfully appreciating the experience. One of the farms I worked with was owned by a family named Fawzi. The father was a man named Bhakti Fawzi. He grew coffee, rice, and sugar. Bhakti was a nice man with a warm personality and a great sense of humor. Within that personality, I sensed a sadness that he tried to keep deep inside. I found myself spending extra time with Bhakti. I liked him, but there was also another reason I tried to spend time on the Fawzi farm. Bhakti had 3 children living at the farm, his older son Vaikal, a younger daughter, probably 12-year-old named Nephi, and then there was Rina. Rina, I estimated, was probably in her early 20s, a few years younger than me. She worked as a nurse at one of the clinics in Baima, and she was breathtaking. A beautiful golden complexion, long dark hair, a trim lean physique, and a beautiful warm smile. Whenever I was at the Fawzi farm and Rina was there, I tried to spend some time with her. Bhakti, the father, and Vaikal, the older brother, were always hovering around during the times I was near Rina, not challenging my presence near her, just chaperoning our time together. Vaikal was a chef at a dining establishment in Baima. He split his time between working on the farm with Bhakti and cooking 4 nights per week in Baima. I also learned that Vaikal practiced Silat training at a studio in town. I asked him if we could spar. He looked at me for a long moment and then agreed. Vaikal was probably 5'7" and maybe 170 pounds. It was all muscle from his hard work on the farm. The Affindi brothers were strong, but not nearly in the condition of Vaikal. Training with Vaikal was physically at another level altogether. He was not only strong but also quick, and he fought hard. I know he pulled his punches with me, but compared to my training with the Affindis, this was far more physical. After our first session, I was bruised and battered, but I had learned a lot from my training with Vaikal. I think he was surprised when I asked him if we could do it again. So it became part of my route to spend my Fridays at the Fawzi farm, train with Vaikal, and try to spend time with Rina. I also became friends with young Nephi. She was a younger version of Rina. She just hadn't blossomed yet. She constantly asked me about America. It seemed like much of what she knew had come from syndicated TV shows broadcast into Indonesia. I tried to translate her television-bred image into the reality of life in the US. My affection for Rina grew the more time I spent with her. Beyond her exotic beauty was a warm, caring person, so completely different from Jasmine. I began to really have strong feelings for her. I understood that Bhakti and Vaikal were trying to be protective of Rina, but my intentions were sincere. I would never do anything to harm Rina. One Friday evening, Bhakti and I were both drinking a local beer called Bintang. I asked him if I could take Rina out for dinner sometime, alone, basically asking his permission. Bhakti sighed and stared out into the twilight. He sat like that for several minutes, silently. I wondered if I had somehow offended him and his family. Finally, he turned back and looked at me. I like you, Owen Isaacson, he told me, but need to protect my family. He added, you see, Rena and Nephi, not my daughters. My nieces, he said. And then he told me a story. In Indonesia, there are a lot of different factions, including various groups of rebels, opposed to the local government. Often the rebels assumed a specific religious ideology, and violence could erupt without any specific reason. One such case of this violence occurred nearly 10 years ago. The rebels came out of the hills. Rena and Nephi had been with Bhakti and Vaikal that day. Nephi was very young at the time, and fortunately for them that day they had all gone to Bima. When they returned they found the aftermath of the rebel attack. Rena and Nephi's mother, Bhakti's sister, had been brutally assaulted and murdered. Their father, it appeared, had tried to defend his wife against the rebels and had been killed too. So you see, Bhakti said, it is my responsibility to now take care of girls. I stared at him, absorbing the horrible story he had just related to me. I could see the pain etched across Bhakti's weathered face as he looked back at me. I also understood why he was so protective of the two girls. Finally, I said to Bhakti, emotion swelling within my chest, Bhakti, I would never do anything to hurt Rena. I told him. He looked at me for a long time and then reached across the wooden table where we sat and clasped my forearm. I believe you, Owen Isaacson, he said to me. It was some weeks later, and at this point Rena and I were officially dating, which meant going places together unchaperoned. I continued to spend time with the Fozzies, and one night I found myself once again drinking beer with Bhakti, just he and I. I had thought a lot about what Bhakti had told me that night, yet never mentioned anything to Rena. I was struggling to come to terms with the violence in the name of religion inflicted upon Rena's family. I had been raised to forgive, but this situation seemed unforgivable. Bhakti, I began. What happened to those rebels? I asked him. Once again the older man stared off into space, summoning thoughts from a darker time. And then he spread his arms, implying his world. There is word for this. We call Mimbalas Dendam. Rebels need to pay for what they do. I interpreted the phrase, Mimbalas Dendam, to mean revenge. We wait, me, other family and village people. We watch. We ask question. We find out who did this terrible thing. We find out where they live. We plan. We find these rebel. And then we punish. I sat there with my beer long empty, staring at this man. In the religious upbringing I had been raised within, there was no such thing as revenge. But as I sat and listened to the story Bhakti told me, I saw total justification in his actions. Philosophically, my world had just shifted. I sat and absorbed this shift. Suddenly, out of the blue, Bhakti changed the subject. Okay, now we talk of other things. A now smiling Bhakti said to me, when you going marry my niece? He asked me, and then burst into laughter. That was a subject that actually I had been thinking about. I had known Rena for almost the total 18 months that I had been in Indonesia. We had been dating for the past 6 months. I knew Rena was the person I wanted to spend the rest of my life with, but I was also cautious based on my disastrous first marriage. But this, I could tell, was different. Certainly I had changed and matured from the sexually suppressed 21-year-old that I was when I started dating Jasmine. I had been brainwashed by the new sexual experiences and had confused lust with real love. I had also received an email from John Scalia, my attorney. He informed me that he never heard from Jasmine or any attorney representing her. Because adultery was grounds for divorce, and we had irrefutable pictures graphically showing Jasmine's adultery, the judge proclaimed us legally divorced. It was a quick, simple email that included his bill. And now, I thought with relief, I was no longer legally married. My time in Indonesia certainly changed me. Though my parents' teaching and the way I was raised helped shape the man I have become, I now had the broader perspective to make up my own mind. And speaking of change, the hard work and the workouts I now regularly practiced had changed me physically too. I happened to catch a reflected image of myself in a mirror one day when Rena and I were in Bima. I was tan, I had filled out and put on weight, mostly muscle. I had this mental image of this skinny, bony, pale kid 6'2" and at most 140 pounds. What I saw in that mirror was different. I hadn't been on a scale, but I estimated I must be at least 180 fairly muscular pounds now. And the workouts with Vaikal and the Effendi brothers had given me a physical confidence I had never had before. My workouts with Vaikal were challenging and invariably painful, but also very satisfying. In fact, when I sparred with the Effendis, now I had to tone things down. They were surprised and pleased at my skill with Silat. But I also believe that they had realized my skill level may have surpassed theirs. There was one part of my relationship with Rena that I had proceeded slowly with. That was sex. Obviously, throughout my marriage with Jasmine, I had become used to sex on a regular basis. Even when we were angry at each other, we still had sex. With Rena, there were several factors. Of course, there was the protectiveness of Bhakti and Vikal sheltering and protecting the girls. I didn't want to betray my friendship with either of them. On the other hand, Reena was beautiful with a natural sexiness that I was extremely attracted to. Her innocence contrasted severely with Jasmine's aggressive sexuality. I tried to be patient, waiting for the right time for Reena and I, but there were many moments when my willpower was tested to the extreme. When I thought about marriage to Reena, there was another thing I wanted before Reena and I took the next step. I wanted my family to meet her. I was certain they would like her, but my parents and my family were a big part of my life, and I felt it was important for them to meet. Later that second year, I began planning a trip for the two of us to the United States. I felt this was necessary and respectful toward my parents. I also hadn't been home in nearly 2 years. Late that second year, we flew home and my mom and dad picked us up at the airport and then drove the 2 hours to Benton. With seemingly no extra effort, Reena quickly won over my mom, dad, and the rest of my family. Reena possessed a sincere warmth that transcended our different cultures. We stayed for almost 2 weeks. One day during that time, Reena and I drove to Taft University and I met with Tim, my advisor. He met Reena and was very gracious. He asked about her and learned she was a nurse in a medical clinic back home. We discussed my work in Indonesia and talked about future opportunities. "Owen," Tim began, "I see a career path for you. You could study for your master's online while you continue your research abroad. I expect within the next few years a professorship will open up, and based on your accomplishments, I would think you would be a prime candidate," he told me. Suddenly, a plan for my professional future became much clearer. But would Reena like living in the US? What about Bhakti, Nephi, and the rest of her family? We had a lot to discuss. One thing I decided was that I would put in my applications online and start working towards my master's. All too soon, our time in Benton was ending. We had an early flight out Friday morning. My cousin drove us to the airport that Thursday afternoon, and we needed to spend the night at the airport Best Western in order to get to the terminal by 6 a.m. Through all the activity of the past few days, I hadn't really thought about the fact that Reena and I would be spending the night together alone for the very first time. No family around to monitor our activities. I became excited thinking about our night together. Unfortunately, I think Reena became nervous. She began acting awkward and withdrawn. The normal bubbly enthusiasm she had for life was subdued. I thought I knew what was bothering her. "Reena, honey," I began. "Just because we will be sleeping in the same bed doesn't mean we have to do anything," I said, as I lightly rubbed her back sitting on that bed at the Best Western. As my hand lightly rubbed her back, I could feel her shake and saw her eyes fill with tears. "That's it," I declared. "I'm going to get another room," I told her and moved to get up. No, Owen," Reena said. I want you," she told me, looking me right in the eyes. For a long time, we just lay, fully clothed, on that motel room bed holding each other. Quietly, we talked. Reena was nervous and excited. That was why she had become emotional. She said she didn't want to disappoint me. Slowly, it was Reena that began. She gently rolled me onto my back with her laying atop me. She slowly began moving, and I felt the pressure of her groin grind into mine. Reena now straddled me. Our bodies pressed tightly together. That night we made love, and it was amazing. We lay like that for a while, content, and I think I even began to drift off into not quite sleep, but a drowsy, euphoric half-wakening. "Owen," she said, bringing me out of my languid mood. "Yes," she said. "Huh?" I asked, not quite sure I heard all of what she had said. "Yes," I said. "Yes, what?" I asked, still confused. "Yes, I will marry you," she told me. "What?" I was now fully awake. "You will?" I exclaimed. I guess I was still a bit confused, happily confused, but nonetheless confused. She saw the puzzled look on my face. "You have declared your love to me, physically, by taking me to bed," she told me. "Now, since you love me, you need to marry me." I lay there thinking. For months now, I had contemplated asking her to be my wife. I think there was a part of me that was unsure what her reply would be. Now I knew. "Yes," I declared. "Of course I want to marry you." And I pulled her beautiful naked body close to me and hugged and kissed her. Abruptly, I stood up and began to put my clothes on. "What are you doing?" Reena asked, puzzled by my actions. "Be right back," I said as I moved toward the door. "I need to get some condoms." I called out to her as I was leaving the room. "Get a lot of them," I heard her shout as the door closed and I headed for the mini-mart. Other than a lot of discussion about our marriage and our future, the long flight back to Indonesia was uneventful. I did tell Reena I wanted to formally ask Bhakti's permission to marry her. She agreed, though it was clear she did not think there would be any problem from Bhakti. And there wasn't. Both Bhakti and Vaikal were overjoyed at the news from Rina and me. I did call my folks and they were happy for us too. I think they were a little more surprised when I told them the wedding would be in Indonesia. For my family, it wasn't the cost that concerned them, it was the travel. My dad had been on an airplane a total of 3 times and my mother once. The idea of flying halfway around the world was what I believe made them nervous. I left most of the wedding planning to Rina and her family. Meanwhile, it was back to work for me. I also began my graduate studies to get my master's degree in agricultural science. During this pre-wedding time, I got to spend a little more time with Rina's little sister Nephi. Nephi looked like a younger version of Rina. At this point, she was 16 and in secondary school called SMP, like high school. Though Nephi looked like Rina and had certainly matured physically into a young woman, she was different from Rina. I think because she was the baby of the family and because of the extreme trauma the family had been subjected to, Nephi had been overprotected. Nephi was not unintelligent and received good marks at SMP. There was just a naivete about her. She did not have the street smarts that Vaikal and Rina had, but her innocence was genuine and pure, and she was a delight to spend time with. I could tell she was nervous about one aspect of my marriage to her sister. "Are you and Rina going to move to America?" she asked me. I watched the worried expression on her face as she waited for my answer. "Nephi," I began, "wherever Rina and I decide to live, there will always be a place for you," I told her. Immediately, the lines of worry smoothed out on her face and a big smile appeared. She just kept staring at me and nodding her head, approving my answer to her worried question. My concern about Nephi came from another direction. I knew Rina and I would need to help protect this beautiful, sheltered young girl from the more unpleasant aspects of life. The wedding day finally came and 6 members of my family, including my mom and dad, made the trip to Indonesia. They stayed at a motel in Bima. The ceremony was non-denominational in a rented hall in Bima. Vaikal arranged all the food and actually helped in the cooking and preparation. It was a fun event, and I was pleased that my parents got to spend some time with Vilik, Bhakti, and Nephi. Everyone seems to get along great. At one point, it was just my dad and I. "Son," he said as he put his arm around me and steered us away from the crowd, "I think you married yourself a fine young woman." "Thanks, Dad," I answered. He was silent for a minute. "You know, with Jasmine," he began. "Dad," I interrupted, "let's not talk about her." "Now, hear me out," he said. "I never quite thought she was right for you. But you seemed so happy for a while. And she was so physical with you. I guess I thought if you were," he paused trying to find the right words, "sleeping with her, you needed to be married." "Dad, it's okay," I said. He ignored me and continued. "Anyway, I apologize for giving you the wrong advice," he said, and we just stood there comfortably for a moment, my dad's arm around my back. "Son, I guess I just wanted to tell you," he said to me. "I think you picked the right one this time." And with that, he clapped me on the shoulder and walked off into the wedding crowd without a glance back. All too soon, the wedding was over. My family had left, and normal life once again began. Though it was different now. Rina and I were living together on a small building on Bhakti's property. It was fairly primitive, but that didn't matter. We were together and close to her family. I would work my normal schedule during the week and continue my studies for my master's in the evenings and the weekends. We would spend time with Rina's family, and I would take extra time with the Effendis, my first host family. And of course, we would spend time with young Nephi. She really was turning into a beautiful young girl. Her innocence and trusting nature was refreshing, but both Rina and I couldn't help but worry about her. We both knew the world could be a rough place. In many ways, it was a blessing that she was so young when tragedy had struck her family. The months stretched on, and I was surprised to realize I was going on my 4th year in Indonesia. There were moments I would come from working all day on a farm, hands filthy, mud on my boots, and wonder, would I be doing this the rest of my life? One day I received an email from Tim Kerwin at Taft about an opening for a professorship. I had completed my master's, and Tim urged me to apply. That night I discussed the opportunity with Rina. Though she had some reservations about leaving her family, she was also excited to think about the opportunity to live in America. She told me she wanted to discuss the possibility with Bhakti. A few days later, she told me she had spoken with Bhakti. True to his kind nature, he urged her to live in America. Deep down, Rina told me, she could see the sadness in his eyes as he smiled and urged her on to a new life far away from her family. About a week later, I received an email from Tim telling me I was their #1 candidate for the position and could I get my affairs wrapped up in Indonesia by the 1st of August. That was only 4 weeks away. I told him I could. It was a sad farewell to all my Indonesian friends. The hardest part was leaving Bhakti, Vaikal, and particularly young Nephi. Rena was like a mother to the girl. The night before we were to leave, Nephi came to our room while we were packing. You could see the tears streaming down her cheeks. "Remember what you promised," she said to me. I stopped and looked at her, searching her eyes for a clue to my forgotten promise. "You told me there would always be a place for me with you," she said. I looked at Nephi, recalling the conversation those weeks ago. "Nephi," I began, "once we get settled in America, of course we want you to come visit and see America. Don't worry," I told her. Nephi sat on the corner of our bed and digested what I had told her. You could almost see her brain processing my words. She then looked at us, nodded, smiled, and left. One of the things about my life in Indonesia was that I spent almost no money. I didn't make much, but what I did make, I saved. I lived rent-free. Much of what I ate came from the farms I worked at, and any food I did buy was inexpensive. There really just wasn't a lot to spend money on. The upshot of my nearly 5 years of savings was that I had nearly $150,000 in my investment account. One of the things I wanted, and I know Rena wanted, was our own house. Fortunately, housing costs near Taft University were still fairly reasonable. We bought an older 3-bedroom house with a 2-acre lot about a mile west of the college. We were able to put nearly half the purchase price down as a down payment. One of the considerations when we were looking for houses was room for her family, particularly young Nephi. Rena, with help from Tim, was able to get a position at the campus health clinic. Though she had the practical knowledge to be qualified to be a registered nurse, she needed to complete some classes to achieve that designation. Meanwhile, I started fall classes and quickly found that I enjoyed my professorship and working with the young people in my classes. The adjustment to life in America was mostly smooth for Rena. She was amazed at the quantity and variety of food at the grocery stores. I took her to a Costco once and she was amazed at their oversized packaging of everything. I recall her seeing a 1.5-gallon jar of mustard and asking me who would need so much mustard. I tried to explain, but even to me my answer sounded ridiculous. The one thing that continued to be difficult was the separation from her family. She missed them terribly. I think because of the tragedy they all went through, they became understandably closer than normal. There were more than a few tear-filled phone calls, especially in those first few weeks. But beyond that, our life together was wonderful. We both enjoyed our jobs. We spent time fixing up our own house, and it was fun to introduce Rena to the different parts of American culture. Both of us worked Monday through Friday, and we tried to make it a weekly event to go out to dinner on Saturday nights. We would try different types of restaurants, from fast food to fine dining. It was interesting the different food that Rena would prefer. For example, she loved Subway, but did not care for Pizza Hut. This particular Saturday, we went to a nicer restaurant near the college called Iris Farm. It was a small bistro-style restaurant known for its wine selection. We had a glass of wine in the bar as we waited for our table. It was about midway through our dinner when all of a sudden the commotion began. "Well, if it isn't my long-lost husband," the voice said behind me. I turned to see who was speaking, but I'd already recognized the voice. Jasmine. It looked like she and one of her friends were coming out of the bar. Well, well, well," she said with false pleasantness. "You look good, Owen. You've filled out some and your normal pasty white skin is tan," she added. I turned to look at her. I noted Rena had a blank, puzzled look on her face. "Hello, Jasmine," I quietly said to her. "So you kind of left me without telling me you were leaving," she continued with the same false good humor with a thread of negativity. I didn't reply. "And who is this little China doll?" she asked, turning her attention to Rena. Her friend giggled at that. Rena, always polite, stood up, smiled, and extended her hand in greeting. "Hello, I'm Rena," she addressed Jasmine. Jasmine's face turned ugly, and she ignored Rena's outstretched hand. The entire time Jasmine had been talking to us, her voice kept getting louder. The other diners were now distracted by the commotion at our table. "Are all the massage parlors closed tonight, honey?" Jasmine commented toward Rena. At that point, I stood, turned around, and faced Jasmine. "Okay, that's enough," I began. "Jasmine, I think it's time for you to leave," I told her. And at that moment, the manager also walked up and politely but firmly ushered Jasmine and her friend out the door. She was still yelling something at me as she was led out. I looked across the table at a shocked Rena. "So that's the story of Jasmine," I told Rena. Rena just looked at me for a long time, trying to equate what she knew of me and our life with Jasmine and my old life. She continued to look at me, still puzzled, as if it still didn't quite make sense. "Rena, you knew I'd been married before," I said. "It ended badly. It was a bad time in my life, as I just told you." I tried to block it out. I guess that's why I never said much about her before tonight. And I nodded toward the exit where Jasmine had been kicked out. "I know," Rena said. "I just didn't know she was that mean." Our marriage ended badly, and after the fight with her brother, I just wanted to get away from her. I said, with any luck, we'll never see her again. I added, hopeful that what I said was true. Jasmine was furious. That bottled-up anger at Owen leaving her all those years ago erupted. She didn't care what the lawyers said. He was her husband. And then to show up with that Chinese chick, or whatever she was, in her town. She was angry and humiliated. Jasmine decided to go to Papaya and talk to Claude. She wanted payback on that a-hole Owen. Maybe Claude could help, she thought. Claude was at the normal back table talking to Armin with a couple of girls hanging around. Regulars at Papaya. She marched straight back to the table and began telling Claude what had happened. And there he was with that chick acting as if he was so much better than me. She concluded, telling her version of what had happened at Iris Garden. Claude sat quietly drumming his fingers on the wood table, trying to digest the information his little sister had given him. Honestly, he thought she was better off without the pencil-necked farmer. So who was the girl he was with? Claude Francis asked. I don't know. I just saw them for a minute. She nearly yelled back at Claude. Easy, easy. I'm not the enemy, Claude began. Just calm down and tell me what she looks like at least, he said. Jasmine took a deep breath and told her brother as much as she could remember about the chick with Owen. I think she said her name was Rita. No, something like Rita. She told him. Okay, Claude said. I'll ask around. He used to work at the college, didn't he? Hey, Denny, Claude yelled over at the long-term bartender Dennis Libby, and with his arm motioned him over. Dennis came over. What's up, Claude? Dennis asked. He was still taking classes at Taft, finally on the verge of getting his degree. You remember the dickwad that Jasmine was married to? Dennis nodded. Keep your eyes open around campus. Let me know if you see him. Will do. Dennis replied. Claude just nodded his appreciation, dismissing Dennis with the same gesture. Jazz, don't worry, I'll ask around. Try to find out what he's doing here. He calmly told her. Okay. He asked. Less than a week later, Claude Francis got the information he needed on Owen Isaacson. He found out that he was now a professor at the college, and he was married to the Asian woman. Her name was Rena, and she worked as a nurse somewhere at the college too. Now, Claude thought, what to do about all this? I kicked his butt once, Claude remembered. Maybe I need to do it again. Also, if the Asian wife is as hot as he'd been told, maybe he could have some fun with her too. Smiling, Claude began to put his plan together. Later that week, Owen got home from the university to see Rena sitting in the kitchen. She looked troubled and deep in thought. Rena, what's wrong? I asked her. She said she had called home, and Nephi was upset about being apart from Rena. Rena had been like a mother to Nephi, and now they lived halfway around the world from each other. Nephi wanted to see Rena, and she was sad. I sat there thinking about the situation, and I began to wonder if we could get her to live with us. She was now 19 and had graduated from SMP. I could begin to look at the possibility of her enrolling next term at Taft. I knew people in the admissions department. I could find out what we needed to do to get Nephi enrolled. I thought back to the conversation Nephi and I had in Indonesia. I had promised Nephi there would always be a place for her with us. I couldn't let her down. Rena and I discussed it. She was happy about this possibility, but also a little concerned. Nephi is so innocent. Do you think she will be okay here? She asked me, a look of concern on her face. I thought for a moment. Rena made a good point. Nephi was so trusting of people, and I knew there were some bad people in the US. But then I thought there are untrustworthy people everywhere, and as long as we were around, we could make sure she was safe. I think, I began, that we will take good care of Nephi. I'll look into it tomorrow. I told Rena. I talked to some people at Taft. It looked like there were a few hoops we would need to maneuver through, but likely by next term we could get Nephi enrolled. Rena told me that Nephi was ecstatic about coming to America, going to college, and most of all living with Rena again. Over the next several weeks, we began planning for Nephi's arrival. There was a lot to do, and we both were still working full-time. When possible, Rena and I commuted to school together. Rena didn't have a US driver's license yet. When our schedules didn't match and the weather was nice, she would ride her bicycle to the clinic. I had warned her to always use the heavy-duty U-shaped bike lock when she got to the health clinic at Taft. Bike theft was common. It happened to be a nice day and I had a late class that Wednesday, so Rena rode her bike. I got home a little after 6, and when I entered I could tell something was wrong with Rena. I found her sitting at the kitchen table, arms wrapped around her shivering body. She didn't say a word. Rena, honey, I rushed to her. What's wrong? I held her and felt the slight trembling, signaling her distress. I stood back and from a few feet away examined her for any type of injury. She looked physically fine, just very shaken up emotionally. Rena, what is it? I asked again. This man, she began, driving a big car, pulled over in front of me on the street when I was riding home, she said. And then she began to tell me the story. She was almost home when a big black vehicle swerved in front of her and stopped. Rena had to brake quickly, or else she would have run into the back of the black vehicle. A man got out, and at first he seemed nice, but then he started acting uncomfortably too nice, and she became worried. He asked her name, where she was going, and where she lived. Rena said she didn't really answer him, tried to be polite, and tried to get by him, but he kept kind of blocking her way. One time he stepped directly in front of her when she tried to ride away. He even grabbed the handlebars to stop her. She finally maneuvered the bike away from him and quickly rode up on the sidewalk to get away. But what really bothered her as she began to ride away, he called out to her, "See you later, Rena." It took her a few minutes to realize it, but she had never given him her name. Claude and Jasmine were sitting in the back of Papaya. Claude had just told Jasmine about his encounter with Rena. "Yeah, scared the shit out of her." Claude laughed and told Jasmine. "Is that it?" Jasmine said. "You just scared her? Is that all you're gonna do?" Claude was starting to get pissed at his little sister. He'd had his people track down her ex's hot little new wife. He found out where they live and some other stuff about them. "What else is it you'd like me to do?" Claude asked with forced patience. "Well, you could start by kicking the shit out of him again," Jasmine began. "And this time I'd like to see it. And maybe have that little bitch wife see it happen too," she added. Claude sat there thinking for a few moments. Yeah, if that's what Jasmine wanted, he'd be glad to kick the guy's ass again. He nodded. "Okay," he told the now smiling Jasmine. "I know where they normally go on Saturday mornings." That Saturday morning the weather was nice and Rena and I went to the park to play tennis. She is better than me. She grew up playing tennis and has far more skill. I try to make up for it with just the physical advantage. She normally wins. At the park there are 3 courts, each fenced in with a tall cyclone fence. If we get there early enough, at least one of the courts is normally open. This particular Saturday, all of them were available. As we played, I noticed that one of the other 2 courts were now occupied, but there was still one vacant court. I then noticed something behind me distracting Rena. She had missed a shot she normally easily makes. Her gaze was over my shoulder and focused on something behind me. I turned to look and saw 2 people coming toward us, carrying tennis rackets. They looked familiar. "Rena, let's keep playing," I called to her, ignoring the 2 people. Behind me I heard the squeak of the aluminum gate open into our tennis court. I stopped and looked at the 2 people entering our court. It was Jasmine and her brother Claude Francis. "There's another court open," I called out to Jasmine and Claude, and pointed to the far court. "We're just going to watch a minute," Claude replied, with a phony smile on his face. "Maybe pick up some pointers," he added. They sat on the wooden bench on the side of the court. Rena and I continued to play, but the anxiety brought on by the 2 spectators' presence ruined our fun. Rena walked to the net, and I met her there. "That's the man who stopped me on my bike," she told me in a quiet voice. "I want to go now," she said. I thought about it for a minute. I didn't want either of those 2 to think they could intimidate us. I would not back down. "Let's just play a few more minutes," I said to Rena. She nodded reluctantly. As we began to resume our game, Claude stood up and walked to Rena's end of the court. "How about doubles?" Claude said. "Me and Rena will play the 2 ex-married people. Come on, it'll be fun." He added, that same false grin on his face. "Owen," Rena called to me. I thought about it for a minute. I knew that Claude was a bully, and the way you defeat a bully was to stand up to them. "All right," I agreed. For just a minute. I called back. Rena volleyed the ball to me, and I hit it back toward Claude's side of the court. He hit it hard, the ball sailing over the fence on our end. I took a deep breath, exited the gate, and went to retrieve the ball. I turned, and through the mesh of the fence, I saw Claude standing quite close to Rena. As I got closer, it looked like his arms were around her. I rushed through the gate to the far end of the court. "And then you follow through," Claude said. He was pretending as if he was giving her some kind of tennis lesson. His large arm was around her back, gripping her wrist. As he finished, he gave the slightest of humps, his groin bumping her rear end, ever so lightly. I knew what he was doing. "Hey!" I yelled at Claude. "Get your hands off her," I said to Claude as I moved quickly toward Rena. My concentration was on Rena as I moved to where she and Claude were. Claude, with his back to me, must have heard me approaching, and he turned away from Rena and threw a looping punch at me. It could have been worse. My silent training with Vikel helped my defensive instincts. But still, though it was not a direct hit, the punch made contact and knocked me down. I sat stunned for a minute, Claude lurking over me, that vicious smile on his face. It brought me back to the beating he had given me in the alley all those years ago. I remember the promise I made to myself. No one was ever going to beat me like that again. And certainly not in front of my wife, I thought. Quickly, I scrambled to my feet. In my silent sparring, there was a lot of wrestling involved. You need to be on your feet. I think I surprised Claude at how quickly I recovered. He hadn't had time to beat me when I was down like last time. You ready to get your butt kicked again? He shouted at me as I stood to face him. In the years since our last confrontation, a couple of things had changed. First off, I was a good 30 pounds of predominantly muscle heavier. Claude was heavier too, but his weight was mostly in his expanding gut. The other thing was, thanks to Vikel and the Affindis, I now knew how to fight. As I turned to face him, I held up my hands the way I had been instructed. "Want to try again, a-hole?" I said. Claude paused for a moment, observing me, and then moved in. Claude relied on brute force and size. I had been trained. He started with a straight right and I saw it coming. I slapped the outside of his forearm, redirecting the punch away from me. How I was trained. In close fighting like this, you use hammer blows instead of straight punching. I hit him in the chest and the side of the jaw. Now any smile was gone. Claude was slightly stunned and angry. "Did I surprise you, punk?" I taunted him. He remembered the defenseless skinny guy he dominated in the alley those years ago. That was not what I was now. Furthermore, this time there was an audience. I bounced on my feet, hands up defensively waiting for his next attack. Claude, hands ready in a brawler's stance, moved toward me. I let him get a half step closer. Then my torso bent parallel to the ground. I delivered a vicious side kick. I could feel the solid density of the larger man as my kick landed. He winced. It had hurt him. "Owen, stop," Rena pleaded. Her request momentarily interrupted my concentration, and Claude moved in, angry now and aggressive. I was within striking distance of his reach, and as he pulled back his arm to deliver the punch, I moved in closer and threw a powerful elbow strike to the side of his head. It knocked him to his knees. I paused at this point. There was no doubt in my mind that he was done. It was time to end this. "Okay, Claude," I said. "Now we're even. Let's forget about all this." "Screw you," he snarled at me. "We're just starting," he told me through labored breaths. "Come on, Rena," I said, ignoring Claude. "Let's go." And I began walking toward her. "Owen," she warned me, her eyes showing her alarm. I turned when he was almost on me. Claude Francis was mounting one last aggressive attack. This time his arms were outstretched to grab me. Once again, the extensive practice with Vikel kicked in. I grabbed his extended wrist in both hands and bent it back. Now I had complete control. Using the wrist as leverage, I bent his arm and put Claude on his back. I then dropped down from above elbow, strike to the solar plexus, and then 2 hammer blows to his head. No doubt about it, he was done now. I heard him moaning, and I knew nothing I had done was lethal, but I was also confident there would be no more attacks from Claude today. Before I left, I quickly returned and kicked him in the face. I looked at Jasmine and gave her a taunting smirk. Rena and I left the court, walking by the speechless and stunned Jasmine. Her mental image of me was quite different than what she had just seen. As we passed, I was not proud of the beating I had given Claude, but I was satisfied that this bully would not pick on us again. Or so I believed at that moment. Our lives continued, and a few weeks later, I noted there had been no sign of Claude or Jasmine. I was pretty sure that we had seen the last of them. Rena was more cautious and rarely rode her bike to school, but other than that, our lives had returned pretty much to normal. One of the projects we had been working on was fixing up the guest bedroom. The cottage we lived in had 3 bedrooms. Rena and I were upstairs, and there were 2 bedrooms on the main floor. One we used as an office-cum-den, and the other was our guest room. So far, we hadn't had any guests, but that was going to soon change. In just over a month, Nephi would be coming. Rena spoke to Nephi often, and the younger girl was extremely excited about coming to America and being reunited with her older sister. I did sense a little sadness from Bhakti at the thought of Nephi coming to live with us. He said it with good humor, but there was a tinge of sadness when he told me he would end up alone on the farm while all his family left him to move to America. On the drive to the airport to pick up Nephi, we were both excited. This would be a new life for this sweet young woman, and we were glad to be able to help her on this new adventure. When we finally saw Nephi at the airport, there was this combination of emotions on her face. Excitement, fear, happiness, and confusion all mixed together on the beautiful face of this innocent, beautiful, young woman. When she finally saw Rena, she ran through the airport, tears streaming down her cheeks, and hugged her older sister. Nephi was abnormally quiet on the drive home, looking out the window, observing the foreign environment, so different from her home in Indonesia. When Rena showed her room, with the bright yellow paint and flowers in a vase, Nephi began to cry again. "Is this really mine?" She asked Rena, tears streaming down her cheeks. Rena just smiled and nodded. Over the next week, we drove Nephi around, showed her the sights, walked through the college, and tried different restaurants. A week from the following Monday's summer session started at Taft. We had enrolled Nephi in some baseline courses to prepare her for her business classes that would start in the fall. Nephi began to acclimate herself to life in America. She seemed to be adjusting well, but we had to break her one bad habit: American daytime TV. The soap operas, the game shows, and the reality shows. They were like junk food for the brain. One thing did concern me. Nephi was so innocent and trusting, and she was beautiful. She looked like Rena but shapelier. She was going to be attractive to the opposite sex. No doubt. One night I brought the subject up with Rena. "You're going to have to talk with her," I said to Rena. "You need to warn her about the average American male." I thought back to my dorm roommates and their stories. I felt an involuntary shiver when I associated guys like that with Nephi. Nephi started her classes and told Rena that everyone was very nice. She started having coffee with a particular guy in one of her classes named Brandon. A week or so later, Brandon asked her to go to a concert the following Friday night. Nephi was excited. I was glad for Nephi, but my concern persisted. I mentioned it to Rena. "Talk to her again. Warn her." I asked Rena. "Don't worry," Rena said. "She knows." I felt like a father on prom night. Rena had to tell me not to give Brandon a curfew. Still, I was wide awake long after my normal bedtime that night. Just as I was finally falling asleep, Rena's phone rang. She was up in a flash, and I was right behind her. It was Nephi. I watched and listened as Rena talked to Nephi. I could tell something wasn't quite right. I looked at the clock, 1:07 a.m. "Okay," I heard Rena say, "we'll be right there." We picked Nephi up outside of a convenience store not far from campus. Rena warned me not to ask her a bunch of questions. That could all wait until the morning. It was clearly evident on Nephi's face that she was upset. We got home and thankfully I fell asleep quickly. In the morning, Rena asked me to go run some errands or something. She wanted to talk to Nephi alone. I returned mid-morning and things seemed to be normal around the house. I didn't really get a chance to find out what had happened throughout the day. Finally, Nephi went to bed early Saturday night, and Rena and I took a walk as the sun was setting. Here's what she told me. The date started fine. They went to a store and bought some beer. Apparently Brandon was of age. Nephi just sipped her beer, and eventually they went to the concert. She said the concert was fun, and so far Brandon was behaving like a gentleman. After the concert ended, Brandon told Nephi he wanted to show her the beautiful view from on top of Glacier Ridge. Nephi said she wondered about how much view they would see at night. But at this point, there was no reason for any great concern. When they got there, he pulled out a marijuana cigarette. Nephi declined. After he smoked, he began kissing Nephi, and so far all was okay. She kind of liked him. Apparently, he unzipped his pants and pulled out his meat and tried to get her to give him a BJ. She told him no, and that she wanted to go home. He agreed and was pleasant. As they approached town, he stopped again on a dark street, pulled out his meat again, and asked for a hand job. She told him no, got out of the car, walked to the mini-mart, and called Rena. This was just what I was worried about. Innocent young Nephi and sex-starved American college male. What are we going to do? I asked Rena. We're not going to do anything. As a woman, this is part of life. Man wants our body. We've got to be careful who we give it to. We all go through this when we are at a certain age. She told me. Do you mean, I began, then hesitated, that you went through this with guys before me? I inquired. We had not spoken much about previous relationships. That, she said, is not your business. I stopped walking and just looked at her, wondering about her experience before me. Just know this, she said, smiling and grabbing my hand. The only person that gets my body from now on is you, she said as she rubbed her shapely figure against me. I was not quite satisfied with her answer, but decided there was no value in pursuing the subject. For the rest of the summer, our lives were much more calm. Nephi showed no effects from her date with Brandon. We just never heard from him again. We spent time showing Nephi the sights while the weather was nice. We took a long weekend and traveled to Benton, and Nephi became reacquainted with my family. Nephi seemed to like America, and all seemed well as we prepared for fall term and full-time studenthood for Nephi. Claude was still pissed off. How in the hell could that pencil neck have kicked his ass so bad? He was going to get some payback. He just wasn't sure when. And then there was Jasmine. She was continuing to bitch to him about how her ex left her. He ran out on their marriage. Sure, she was messing around with Jerome and maybe one other guy. She was still young. She deserved to have some fun before she settled down and had some kids. I just gotta find something on the guy, Claude thought. He had tried with the new wife, but she was too smart. There just had to be some way to get even with this guy, and make him pay for embarrassing him and humiliating Jasmine. Also gotta be careful I'm not caught doing anything. I don't want to end up in jail again. I'll get my sources out checking around. Claude decided. Maybe something would turn up. I had a full load of classes fall term. Rena had gotten her accreditation as a registered nurse and was working full-time at the campus clinic. She also had received her driver's license, and we had bought her a used car. Nephi was taking a full load of classes, and both Rena and I would see Nephi occasionally throughout the week on campus. There was no further mention of Brandon, but I do know that Rena and Nephi had discussed the specific situation and the general complexities of dating. When I would ask Rena about Nephi in this regard, all she would tell me was that Nephi was young, attractive, and healthy. She would have her share of experiences. After all, she was 19 years old, not a child. I agreed to a point. It was just that Nephi had led a much more sheltered life than normal. That still concerned me. For a while, the discussion through the beginning of fall term was almost entirely about classes, homework, and the happenings at Taft. I heard nothing about dates, activities, or boyfriends from Nephi. But one day I did see her with a couple of people across campus at the student coffee shop. I thought I may have recognized one of the people she was with, but it was too far to be sure. The following week, as we prepared for dinner, I saw that Rena had only set the table for two. "Isn't Nephi having dinner with us tonight?" I asked. She called. Rena replied, "She's out with friends. I guess they're getting something to eat in town. Is this a date?" I hesitantly asked. "Owen," Rena smiled and said to me, "She's making friends. That's normal. At some point she'll have a boyfriend and it will be all okay."